like list, you know. Um, so most years at the auction, I've offered a sermon topic for an auction item. And this past year, I offered instead a workshop on a subject of your choice, adult RE program. And Fred and Debbie bid on it. But when I asked them, would you rather I just do a sermon? They said, oh yes, please do a sermon. And so this was the sermon topic they gave me, was immigration. And because it's dearly affected people that they and many of us love, who have had to leave this community and go back to Mexico, because after years of fighting for spousal recognition and citizenship, that fight was ultimately not won, and it was easier for the couple in our community to move back home. So, or what was home for one of them. And so as it affects people near and dear to many of us, it's an important issue to take a look at. I know a few weeks ago in March, Julica Herman de la Fuente came and told you about her personal journey and the journey of her father as well. And I had an opportunity to read her sermon and hear what she told you, which was a great personal story. I'm not someone who's personally affected much myself. My family came here, the closest immigrants in my family are like 4 generations ago, but some of them are as many as 13 generations ago or more that my ancestors came to America. But they too came as immigrants. I have maybe a small amount of Native American blood, as many of us do, but largely I am the product of immigrants. Immigration is one of the most divisive subjects in America today. It's probably only after abortion and LGBT rights and somewhere like a little bit less divisive maybe than those and more divisive than climate change, right, in that spectrum of the most dividing issues between us. And of course, immigration, out of all of them, was made the sort of hallmark issue, the central focusing issue of the last presidential campaign. More than anything else, our president campaigned on the idea that he was going to build a wall between us and Mexico to keep the immigrants who he talked about as violent, as criminals, and as detrimental to the American economy, to keep them out. And that was his biggest campaign promise and continues to be a focal point for his administration through several different pronged approaches where he has addressed the issue of immigration. So it's one of those issues that defines the left from the right in America today. And as such, it's one of the issues we argue about. And what I've been thinking about is the fact that the more we argue, science shows us, the more entrenched people become in their position. So I heard a report on NPR recently. I tried to find the source of it for you and I couldn't, but the argument was basically that when we argue, people go into a fight or flight mode, the same way as they do when they're under physical attack. When your ideas are under attack, you go into fight or flight. And that doesn't let the argument in. It doesn't make you open to hearing other points of view. It makes you ready to fight or run away from the situation. And other scientific studies have shown us that the more you present people with facts, the less they're going to change their mind. So it's very frustrating for those of us who are fact-based and rational approaches and who are love to argue, like myself, that this is not getting us anywhere on these issues. I think, and one of the things that happens when you are arguing is, if you're arguing with facts, people will say it's a moral issue. And they'll just go to this place of, well, it doesn't matter how many facts you throw at me, it's a moral issue. If you argue that it's a moral issue, it doesn't matter how much you argue morality, this is about facts. And people will do this switching very quickly in how they respond to your arguments. So I could give you facts, And I could give you a moral argument, but if you're not already with me on this issue, it probably is not going to change your mind. So what do we know about what does change people's minds? Well, I look back to what we knew and used and learned from in the movement to change people's opinions in this country on LGBT rights. And that was that the more people feel like they know someone and have heard their story, the more they change their hearts. So, what I wanted to do is tell you a few stories today. Because we need to connect at a heart level instead of a head level. We know the opposition to immigration reform and fighting for stricter immigration standards also comes from an emotional place. I think we see intuitively that it comes from a fear. There's a fear of jobs being taken away, a fear of scarcity of resources, and of those resources, particularly of healthcare, not being available to oneself and one's loved ones, and resources of jobs, that we're not going to be able to make enough money to feed ourselves and our loved ones, to house ourselves and our loved ones because of immigrants. And people have legitimate fears about employment and healthcare and cost of living issues and economic security. People in this country, on average, despite the economy rebounding, individuals are not doing much better, if better at all, especially in the middle class and lower. We haven't come back to 1950s standards of living. Our children make less than we do. I make less until a few weeks from now. I have always made less than my parents have ever made, at the same ages. And my children are expected to make less than I do. And that's the reality for every generation after the baby boomers, that we make less and less and less. So an anti-immigrant stance comes from an extension of positive conservative values: American pride, fiscal conservatism, belief in strong law enforcement, belief in following rules. And sometimes it also comes out of negative ones. Sometimes it comes out of xenophobia and racism. And this is why we on the left focus so much on the dreamers. They are people who were brought here by their parents. They're the most innocent, quote unquote, of immigrants, right? So we can hold them up as we did in the civil rights movement. We found the most perfect of examples to hold up. Like in Rosa Parks, there were women before her who had gotten arrested for not relinquishing seats on buses, but they weren't a pure enough victim of racism for us to build a movement around. And it's a sad thing, it's an unfair thing that we have to look for this, but that's what we naturally kind of on the left do when building a movement. And so in immigration, we look to the dreamers. They didn't make the choice to come here, so we start with them. And we talk about how this is the only home they've ever known. Some of them were brought here at very young ages. They may not remember the language of the country that their citizenship is in. They think of this as home. They've gone through our schools. They've lived an American life for most of their lives. And their hopes and their dreams are the American hopes and dreams. They want to go to school. They want to have good lives, get a good job, raise a family, have health and love and happiness. So what I want to talk about is about love, compassion, about opening our hearts, because that's what this issue is all about. What we do in our society, in all societies, is we learn to create in-groups and out-groups, and make the out-groups the other, and then convince ourselves that they don't deserve ethical treatment. They don't deserve what we have. The Nazis did this in Germany, convinced people that the Jews were dirty, greedy, and responsible for their problems. They scapegoated them. And we are scapegoating our immigrants now. We did this with Africans, allowed ourselves to enslave them because we were convinced that they were lesser. In our society now, we do it with gays and lesbians, we do it with Muslims, and we most of all do it with immigrants. Maybe not most of all, but we certainly do. We convince ourselves that we who are here already have a right to be here, and those who aren't here already don't have a right to be here. But these borders are our constructs. They're not God's. They're not nature's. We come here, and then we put down a line, and we say, you can't come here now because we're here, and this is our spot. And then we convince ourselves that we're better in some way or more deserving of being here. We were born here. We know the language here. Those people weren't here when we got here. I think of the poem Psalm by Wisława Szymborska, a Polish poet who wrote this. Oh, the leaky boundaries of man-made states. How many clouds float past them with impunity? How much desert sand shifts from one land to another? How many mountain pebbles tumble onto foreign soil in provocative hops? She says, need I mention every single bird that flies in the face of frontiers or alights on the roadblock at the border? A humble robin, still, its tail resides abroad while its beak stays home. If that weren't enough, it won't stop bobbing. So, to open our hearts, to change our minds, I think we need stories. Stories like the one of Jorge Garcia, who lived in Lincoln Park, Michigan. Jorge, who at the age of 39 is not eligible to be a dreamer, but who came here when he was 10 and has married and raised a family and worked a job here in our state. And after 3 decades of living in Michigan, in the US, he was deported. His children are citizens. His wife is a citizen. And they tried to get him citizenship, but ended up in the deportation process instead. And so he ended up in deportation and was sent back to a country that he didn't know this year. Or here's a story about 27-year-old Kevin Vasquez, a recent college graduate who lives in Grand Rapids. He was brought here at the age of 8. His family came in on valid visas, but stayed when the visas expired, like so many do. He's in the DACA program that was under so much threat this year, and his DACA authorization is up for renewal this year. If his status is taken away, he won't be able to work or drive anymore. His dreams for the future will be gone. This is the first step. Hearing stories of people like us raised in America, graduating from US high schools, doing normal kid things, but actually also living as undocumented immigrants. Once we can open our hearts here, just a crack, we start to let the barriers between self and other come down. If we let these stories open our hearts, then there's hope. And we have to do this, the work of opening our hearts and standing on the side of love. We have to do this because this is the universal religious impulse that we believe in. Every religion in the world tells us about love and about how to treat our neighbor. That's the golden rule. It's the greatest task, the strongest commandment, the purpose of all these institutions that we build and the work that we do. It comes down to this: love your neighbor. And who is your neighbor? When Jesus asked that, he told the story of the Good Samaritan, a story of an outsider, someone from a group that was despised, and how he turned out to be the true neighbor. And who is our neighbor? As a country, Mexico. Jesus is also reported to have said, in God's love there is no Jew or Gentile. He sat and ate with lepers, and he said that God will welcome into heaven those to whom God can say, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. So what then, I ask you, is the Christian thing to do in response to illegal immigration? The Bible would tell us the answer is simple: offer sanctuary. In the biblical world, the way you treated your guests was according to a sacred rule. You offered hospitality and protection. That's why Lot, when an angry mob demands that he send out the angels that he has offered shelter to, offers to hand over his daughters instead. Women were property, and this was about how you treated the stranger. That's what the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is about. It's about how we treat the immigrant, which is to welcome them. It's not about homosexuality, which is subterfuge. One more immigrant story. This one I'm sharing as recounted by Jack Lessenberry, who many of you know from Michigan Public Radio. He says, the story I'm about to tell you was first reported by Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter David K. Johnston and biographer Gwenda Blair, and it concerns a 16-year-old German boy who would later be called Fred, who ran away from home to avoid eventually being drafted. He managed to get out on a packed steamship headed for America in 1885. Though he was a minor, he wouldn't have been eligible for the DACA program if it had then existed, because he wasn't brought here by his parents, but came on his own, lying about his age. He landed in New York, but eventually went to Seattle, where he opened a less than five-star restaurant with a curtained-off area that researchers say most likely served as a low-rent bordello. Later, according to Johnston, Fred would build a more elaborate hotel for similar purposes north of Seattle, a building he erected on land he didn't own. Later, when the Klondike Gold Rush began, Fred went down to the Yukon Territory where, according to Johnston, he built a sort of bar and grill, calling the joint the Arctic. It offered hard liquor and sporting ladies, as the prostitutes were called. Jack Lessenberry continues, hardly a model immigrant, you might say. But to add insult to injury, Fred, after becoming a citizen after lying about the year he came to New York, decided to go back to Germany. His wife hated this country. But though Fred went home with considerable money, Germany expelled him as an undesirable draft dodger. So for the rest of his life, he lived in New York City. But while he had become rich, that wouldn't buy Fred a long life. He was still in his 1940s when he would become one of 500,000 Americans who would perish in the great flu epidemic of 1918 at the end of the First World War. His wife and 12-year-old son, who was also named Fred, would survive. Because of his early death, that long-ago immigrant would never live to see his child grow up. Fred had been dead, in fact, nearly 30 years before his best-known grandson was born. That descendant, by the way, is President Donald Trump. Often we tell stories like this on the left to point out that we're all of us, those who are not Native American, descended from immigrants, whether they came here willingly or unwillingly in the case of slavery. But rather than telling these stories in a kind of gotcha way, like Jack Lessenberry does right there, honestly, I think we need to tell our immigrant stories in a real way, a heartfelt way that says, yes, I too know, or my ancestors knew, what it was like to flee oppression or economic insecurity and make a dangerous journey to a new land so that our family could have a better life. That's what the struggle over immigration is about. It's a struggle between, I'm scared for me and my family, so I want to protect them, and I know what it's like to be scared, so I want to welcome others. It's about moving out of our own fear and connecting to the story of someone else and finding our common humanity. And the way we do that is by sharing our stories, whether you're a first generation or a second generation or 14th generation immigrant like myself. This is what our country is best at. When conservative values would have us hoard America, keep America to ourselves, we need to respond not with argument, but from our love for America also. Our love for America as a land of opportunity, the land where we lift our lamp beside our door and welcome in the huddled masses yearning to be free. America, the melting pot where people of all cultures come together. That's an America I value and want to keep. And we need to share that vision of America more. And similarly, we need to share our religious values. And what is religion about? Christianity is about love thy neighbor. Judaism about the Exodus story of coming to a new land. Unitarian Universalism about standing on the side of love or answering the call of love. Religion has a real clear view about immigration, and that's because religion over and over again takes us out of our individual protectionism and has us look for how to build beloved community. It's there to inspire us, to call us, to demand that we try everything we can to be the best Americans we can be, the best people we can be, the best neighbors we can be, the shirt off of our backs, borders down, other cheek turned, open-doored society that is the beloved kingdom here on earth. And this society we live in may never get there to that golden vision, but we strive for it always. May it be so.